For 3 years, she'd watched the Hendersons parade through her life like they owned it. Tom and Corinne Henderson lived 3 houses down on Maple Grove Drive, a tree-lined suburban street where everyone smiled and mowed their lawns on Saturdays. Margaret had lived alone in her colonial for 15 years, ever since her divorce from Richard. She'd built a quiet life, her garden, her books, her morning coffee on the back porch. It was small, but it was hers. Then Corinne became HOA president. It started small, a letter about the shade of Margaret's front door, another about the height of her hedges. Then came the inspection notices, the fines, the increasingly threatening letters from the HOA attorney. Corinne Henderson had discovered a power she'd been missing her whole life, and she wielded it like a scalpel against anyone who didn't conform to her vision of suburban perfection. But the pool was the final insult. 2 years ago, the Hendersons had installed a resort-style swimming pool, 15,000 square feet of pristine blue water, complete with a waterfall feature and underwater lighting. It was extraordinary. It was also exactly what Margaret had wanted to build for herself, before the HOA had rejected her application 3 times over aesthetic concerns. Within weeks, Corinne started leveraging the pool as a social weapon. She'd host elaborate pool parties on Friday nights and Saturday afternoons. Margaret would watch from her bedroom window as the neighborhood's elite, the doctors, the lawyers, the people who made real money, climbed over her fence line mentally, deserting their own ordinary suburban lots for Corinne's aquatic palace. Then came the children. Margaret first noticed them on a Tuesday in June. 3 kids, 2 of them definitely not the Hendersons' biological children, cannonballing into the pool while Corinne lounged in an Italian chaise lounge, drink in hand. Then Wednesday, then Thursday. By Friday, it became clear. Corinne had opened her pool to the neighborhood's children during the day, turning it into an unsupervised daycare while the actual parents worked. And on weekends, she opened it to everyone. The rules were simple, Corinne explained when Margaret finally confronted her at the mailbox one brutally hot Saturday. It's a community asset now. We're all about community, aren't we, Margaret? That smile. That practiced, patronizing smile that suggested Margaret was petty for even asking. It's your pool, Margaret said quietly, on your property. And we're good neighbors, that's what good neighbors do. Corinne adjusted her sunglasses, unlike some people. The dig landed exactly where it was meant to. Unlike some people, the ones who painted their doors the wrong color, who let their hedges grow too tall, who dared to want a pool of their own without asking permission from the woman in the Italian sunglasses. That night, Margaret sat in her kitchen with a glass of wine and made a decision that would change everything. If Corinne could flaunt her wealth and her control, Margaret could too. She had money, not Henderson money, but enough to build something better. The pool contractor she hired was named Derek, and he came highly recommended. He was in his early 50s, weathered by sun and work, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that Margaret appreciated immediately. He came to the house on a Monday morning with blueprints and a measuring tape. "You want it big," he observed, looking at her plans. "Bigger than the Hendersons," Margaret confirmed. Derek didn't ask questions. Over the next 2 weeks, he and his small crew began the excavation. It was arduous, dirty work. They brought in heavy machinery, an excavator, a bulldozer, dump trucks. The backyard transformed into a construction site, and Margaret found herself strangely energized by the chaos of it. The sound of the machinery, the smell of earth being turned over, the visible evidence that she was doing something, changing something, reclaiming her space. By the second week of July, the hole was enormous, roughly 20 feet by 30 feet, dug 8 feet deep into the red clay soil. Derek had warned her about the water table, but the ground beneath her property seemed stable. "Good bones," he'd said, "should be fine." It was during the 3rd week, on a Tuesday morning around 9 o'clock, when Derek's excavator hit something. It wasn't a subtle thing. Margaret heard it from inside her kitchen, a sound like the machine had struck concrete. Not the gentle tap of a rock, but a solid, unmistakable crack that made Derek cut the engine immediately. She walked out to the site, squinting against the sun. Derek was already out of the excavator, walking the perimeter of the hole with a frown. "Weird," he said when he saw her. "There's something down here, something solid, concrete maybe. Could be old septic, but I've never seen one laid out like this." Margaret climbed down into the hole with him, 5 feet down, 6 feet, until the walls rose above their heads. The ground was rich and dark, but Derek was right. There, partially exposed by the excavator's bucket, was something gray and geometric, Not natural, not modern. "How old is your house?" Derek asked. "Built in 1987. I bought it in 2008. "This is older than that, maybe much older." Derek knelt down and brushed some earth away from the edge. "We should probably call someone, might be a historic site or something." But Margaret was already thinking ahead, calculating timelines and complications. An archaeological investigation would delay the pool. Delay meant she'd have to face the summer ending with nothing to show for it, while Corinne's pool glinted mockingly from 3 houses down. Delay meant failure, and Margaret had had enough of failure. "How much delay are we talking about?" she asked carefully. "Could be a few days, could be months if they find anything. Historic Society gets involved, all kinds of permits." "Let me get a structural engineer out here first," Margaret interrupted. "Before we call anyone, just to assess what we're dealing with. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just old concrete from the original construction." Derek hesitated. She could see the conflict on his face, the part of him that wanted to do things by the book, and the part of him that understood that books were sometimes written by people who'd never actually wanted anything badly enough to fight for it. "Okay," he finally said, "but if it's something real, Margaret, we tell someone." Margaret nodded. She meant it at the time. She called Robert Chen, a structural engineer she'd found online, and he came out the following morning. He brought ground-penetrating radar equipment and spent 3 hours taking readings. Margaret stood in the sun, sweating through her blouse, watching his face as he studied the readings on his laptop. When he was done, he climbed out of the hole and walked over to her. "It's a cellar," he said. "Pre-war, I'd guess. 1920s, maybe 1930s. It's sealed. The top is concrete, probably poured over to cap it decades ago. The structure seems sound, actually, surprisingly solid. Whoever built it knew what they were doing." "It's just a cellar?" Margaret asked, relief flooding through her. "Just a cellar. Not sure why they buried it, but that's not uncommon for older properties. Sometimes there were original homes on lots before the modern house was built. Sometimes people just decided they didn't need the space and sealed it up." He looked at her. "The real question is whether it affects your pool construction. If you dig into it, you'll expose it. Might compromise the structure if you're not careful, might not. Depends on how deep you want to go and how much weight you're planning to put on top." Margaret's mind was already working. A cellar, on her property, sealed for decades. The kind of thing that would require permits and investigations and phone calls to the Historic Society. Unless nobody knew it existed. "What if I just dug around it?" she asked slowly. "Adjusted the pool location to avoid it?" Robert looked at her for a long moment. "You could do that, it's your property, but I'd have to recommend against it in writing. Technically, you should report it. It's part of your home's structural history. Could affect resale value, insurance, everything." "But I could do it," Margaret pressed. "You could, wouldn't be the first person to do something they shouldn't do." He gave her a significant look. "But then you'd always know it was there, wouldn't you? Living on top of it." She didn't answer him. That evening, Margaret called Derek and told him to proceed with the excavation, but to work around the concrete cap. She said nothing about calling the Historic Society. She said nothing about the cellar at all. Derek seemed relieved. Complications weren't good for his business, and the work resumed the next morning. For 3 weeks, the crew dug around the cellar. The pool began to take shape, a beautiful, sprawling rectangle that would make Corinne's look like a puddle. Margaret got daily updates. Derek sent her photos. She allowed herself to imagine it complete. The crystalline water, the lights she'd add, the way she'd invite the neighborhood over and see that recognition in their eyes when they realized she had won. By late August, the pool was nearly finished. The interior had been waterproofed and painted that specific Caribbean blue that Margaret had chosen. The equipment was installed. The filter system ran smoothly. They were days away from filling it. Margaret was euphoric. She'd done it. She'd taken Corinne's best shot and built something better. It was a Tuesday morning when Derek called her. "We're about to start filling," he said. "Water truck is coming at 9. You want to be here for the first pour." "Yes," Margaret said immediately. "I'll be there." She'd taken the day off work. She'd bought champagne. She was going to stand in her backyard and watch her victory materialize. She still remembers the sound of the water hitting the pool bottom. That rushing, roaring sound of thousands of gallons cascading into the basin. Derek was there, along with 2 of his crew. They all stood watching the water level rise, that pure blue becoming deeper and richer as it filled. Beautiful pool, Derek said, standing beside her. Really beautiful, you did good, Margaret. She smiled. For the first time in months, she felt genuinely happy. The water reached 6 feet, then 7. The crew had calculated for 8 feet maximum depth, more than enough for swimming, diving if you wanted to. The water climbed. Margaret watched the level rise, inexorable, filling the emptiness with liquid perfection. At 7.5 feet, the ground began to crack. It started as a thin line, barely visible against the pool deck. Then another line, then another. They spread outward from the center of the pool like a spider web, like a fracture in glass. Derek's smile faded. "Stop the truck," he yelled to the crew. But it was too late, or too fast, or the damage was already done. Because suddenly, with a sound like the earth groaning, the entire center section of the pool bottom simply gave way. The concrete cap beneath them, the one that had been holding back whatever was in that cellar for decades, had finally failed under the weight and pressure of 10,000 gallons of water. The pool didn't just drain, it collapsed inward like a broken jaw, and the water poured down into the darkness below with a deafening roar. The crew scrambled backward as the ground shifted. A section of the pool wall crumbled, and then, as the water cleared the opening, they could see it clearly. A staircase, leading down into the earth. Margaret stood frozen, watching her dream literally descend into darkness. But more than that, she could see, as the water cleared and the interior of the cellar became visible, that there was something down there. Shapes, silhouettes, boxes maybe, and then, catching the August sunlight, a glint of metal. "Jesus Christ," Derek breathed. And that's when they heard the scream. Corinne Henderson had been watching from the fence line between their properties. She'd come over to gloat about something. Margaret would never know exactly what. And instead, she'd watched Margaret's pool catastrophically fail in real time. But it wasn't the pool collapse that had made her scream. It was what she could see in the open cellar. It was the same moment that Margaret recognized what the metal glint was. A license plate, an old one, attached to what looked unmistakably like the front of a car. The police arrived within 20 minutes of Derek calling 911, though it felt much longer to Margaret. She stood in her backyard, soaking wet. She'd waded into the partially drained pool to get a better look at the cellar opening, a decision she'd immediately regretted, and answered the officer's increasingly intense questions while trying not to stare down into the darkness. "You didn't know it was here?" Officer Ramirez asked for the 3rd time. He was a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything about Margaret. The designer pool furniture she'd bought in anticipation, the champagne bottle still sitting on the patio table, the expression of shock and denial that probably looked, to her trained eye, exactly like a guilty person's face. "I didn't know," Margaret repeated. "My contractor found the concrete cap during excavation. We had it assessed. The engineer said it was just a cellar, probably from an older structure on the property. He said we could build around it." "And you didn't report it to the Historic Society, didn't contact the city?" Margaret said nothing. Her attorney, who she'd called immediately and who was currently 15 minutes away, had advised her not to elaborate beyond basic facts. But the silence itself was damning. Officer Ramirez wrote something in her notebook. Around them, other officers had arrived. They'd set up barriers around the pool area. A detective, Detective Morris, according to his badge, was at the cellar's edge with a flashlight and a phone to his ear, reporting what he was seeing to someone, presumably his supervisor. "That's a vehicle," Officer Ramirez said quietly, more to herself than to Margaret. "Definitely a vehicle, looks like a car, old, really old." "How long?" Margaret asked. "How long would a car have to be down there for?" She didn't finish the question. "Could be years, could be decades." Ramirez looked at her. "When did you move in?" 2008, but the house was built in 1987. "And before that?" "I don't know, I didn't research the property history that thoroughly, just the usual real estate stuff, title search, home inspection." Margaret's voice sounded strange to her own ears, too high, too defensive. "Why would I research it? I didn't know there was a car buried in my yard." The morning progressed with excruciating slowness. More police arrived. Then fire department personnel with special equipment. Then, eventually, a team from the state police's forensic division. They brought generators and lighting rigs and began the careful process of excavating around the vehicle without damaging it further. Margaret stood under an umbrella that Derek had brought her. The sun was merciless and high, and watched her backyard transform into a crime scene. Because that's what this was, though nobody would say it out loud yet. A crime scene. The presence of a buried car meant one of two things. Either someone had accidentally driven into a hole and become trapped decades ago, or someone had deliberately hidden a vehicle. Neither scenario was good. By noon, the skeleton of the car had been fully excavated. It was a 1956 Chevrolet, dark blue and surprisingly intact despite its decades underground. The forensic team photographed everything, processed everything, moved with the methodical patience of people who'd seen enough terrible things to know that rushing made it worse, not better. Margaret's attorney, David Chen, had arrived by 10 o'clock. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-40s, with an expensive suit and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested he'd walked his clients through worse than a buried car in their swimming pool. He'd advised her to say nothing more to the police without him present, and then he'd positioned himself beside her like a shield, occasionally murmuring, "My client has nothing to add," whenever an officer tried to engage her directly. "This is routine," he assured her quietly, seeing the panic on her face. "They have to treat it as a potential crime scene until they know what they're dealing with. That doesn't mean you're a suspect." But Margaret didn't feel routine. She felt like she was drowning, which seemed darkly ironic given the circumstances. It was around 1 o'clock when Detective Morris approached her directly, David moving to intercept, but Morris held up a hand. "Just an informational question," he said. "Nothing evasive about this. Miss Chen, I've pulled the public records for your property. The house was built in 1987. Before that, the lot was vacant for about 6 years, starting in 1981. Before that, there was a house here, built in 1952, demolished in 1981. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. "The car," Morris continued, "is from 1956, so it was very likely buried while the original house was still standing. That means this wasn't someone's recent accident or cover-up. This is historical. This is something that happened decades ago." "Okay," Margaret said slowly. "That's actually good news for you," Morris said, "because it means you're definitely not responsible. Whatever happened here, it happened long before you owned the property. The question now is just figuring out what it was." He walked away before she could respond, leaving Margaret and David standing in the summer heat. "That's good," David said. "That's actually very good, you're clear." But Margaret wasn't clear, not in the way that mattered, because as the afternoon wore on and the forensic team worked more carefully around the vehicle, they began pulling things out of it. A leather briefcase, the leather cracked and hardened by age. A woman's shoe. And then carefully, a small human skull. Margaret's knees nearly gave out. David caught her arm and guided her to a chair on the patio. She sat down hard, her mind refusing to fully process what she was seeing. "There's a body in the car," she heard someone say. "Multiple bodies," someone else corrected. "I'm seeing at least 3 distinct skeletal structures." The champagne bottle still sat on the table in front of her, beating with condensation, celebrating a victory that had just transformed into something unimaginable. Margaret stared at it, then at her beautiful backyard, now transformed into an archaeology of death. By 6 o'clock, the entire neighborhood knew. Corinne Henderson had apparently called every single person on Maple Grove Drive, probably while standing at the fence line, probably with a carefully wounded expression, sharing the news of Margaret's horrific discovery like it was a personal tragedy rather than a stroke of incredible, ruinous luck. By the time the evening news vans started arriving, the street was lined with neighbors, all of them staring at Margaret's house like it was a haunted attraction. She watched from inside through her kitchen window as Corinne Henderson gave what looked like an interview to a local news crew. Corinne was dressed in her concerned neighbor outfit, a tasteful cardigan despite the heat, her hair perfect, her expression grave. Margaret could read her lips well enough. "We had no idea what was beneath us." Margaret had no idea either, poor woman. She just wanted a pool. Poor woman, like she was pitiable. Like the universe was playing a cruel joke on Margaret specifically, when the reality was so much larger and stranger than that. David had recommended she not speak to the media, not answer her door, and definitely not interact with any neighbors. "Let the police do their investigation," he'd said. "When they determine what happened, everything will make sense and you'll be completely exonerated." But Margaret wasn't sure anything would make sense. She wasn't sure exoneration worked when you'd been trying to cover up something, even if that something had nothing to do with the bodies now being carefully removed from your yard. By 8 o'clock that evening, Detective Morris returned with a warrant to search the property more thoroughly. "Standard procedure," he'd assured her, but it still felt like a violation, watching officers walk through her house with flashlights and gloved hands, opening drawers, examining her personal documentation, looking for something that might connect her to a 1956 car buried in her backyard. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Margaret had never known about the car. She'd never known about the seller. She'd known only that she was tired of being made to feel small by a woman in expensive sunglasses, and she'd tried to build something that would make her feel less small. Instead, she'd literally unearthed a mass grave. By midnight, a preliminary forensic assessment had been made. 3 bodies, all human, all skeletal remains consistent with a burial date of roughly 1956 to 1958. The car's registration, once recovered and verified, indicated it had been registered to a woman named Eleanor Hartwick, age 31, last reported missing on June 15, 1956. That's when the news vans got truly excited. Because Eleanor Hartwick hadn't just disappeared. She was the daughter of Victor Hartwick, founder of Hartwick Industries, a major regional manufacturing company that had since been sold and absorbed into larger corporations. Eleanor's disappearance had been a historical mystery, a famous cold case that had never been solved. Her mother had died decades later, never knowing what happened to her daughter. And now, 68 years later, Eleanor's remains had been found in Margaret Chen's backyard, along with 2 other unidentified individuals. The story was no longer local news. By morning, it would be national. By morning, Margaret was no longer just a woman trying to build a pool. She was the person who discovered the famous Hartwick murder site. She was the story. She was the mystery. And she would never be able to escape the fact that she'd tried to cover it up, even unintentionally. The investigation proceeded quickly after that. The 3 bodies were eventually identified. Eleanor Hartwick, age 31, her husband, James Hartwick, age 33, and Eleanor's sister, Catherine Hartwick, age 28. All 3 had gone missing together on June 15, 1956, and had been presumed either to have run away together or to have met with foul play. It was never determined. The case had gone cold within months. Now, 68 years later, the mystery was solved, not by detective work, but by a woman who'd wanted a swimming pool. The 4th discovery came 3 days later, when the forensic team examining the cellar more thoroughly found journals. 2 of them, their leather covers somehow preserved by the sealed environment, their pages still legible despite the decades and damp. One belonged to Eleanor, one belonged to Catherine. What those journals revealed would explain everything. The disappearance, the burial, the reason why 3 young people had been sealed beneath a concrete cap and left to become myth. But Margaret wouldn't learn that truth until much later. For now, she was simply trying to survive the media circus that had descended on her home. Reporters camped on her lawn. True crime podcasters appeared on her street, speaking seriously into phones about the suburban deception and what secrets might be hidden in your own backyard. Corinne Henderson, meanwhile, had become an unofficial media liaison for the neighborhood, offering commentary and historical perspective on the property whenever a camera appeared. Margaret watched from her house as Corinne, interviewed multiple times over several days, expressed concern for Margaret's well-being, spoke about the tragedy of the Hartwick family, and with each retelling, positioned herself further away from Margaret and closer to the role of the sensible neighbor who'd seen it coming all along. There was always something off about that property, Corinne said in one particularly cruel soundbite. The previous owner, not Margaret, the one before, everyone knew he was odd. Maybe he knew something. It was a lie. The previous owner had been a retired teacher who'd lived there for only 5 years before selling to Margaret. But by then, Corinne had already planted the seed of doubt, already suggested, without saying it directly, that this whole thing had an aura of inevitability, that anyone paying attention should have seen it. By the following Tuesday, when the story finally began to fade from the national news cycle, a celebrity scandal had erupted, drawing the media's attention elsewhere. Margaret found herself in the strange position of being simultaneously notorious and invisible. The pool was destroyed. The cellar was sealed again, this time by official order. Her yard was nothing but torn-up earth and sad memories. The Hartwick family, or what remained of it, a few elderly cousins, released a statement thanking the police and the forensic team for finally solving the mystery, and giving them closure and answers after so many decades. Nobody thanked Margaret, though some victims' rights groups did mention her in their press releases, crediting her with helping to bring this family's tragedy into the light. Margaret did not feel grateful for that credit. It was on a Thursday morning, nearly 2 weeks after the discovery, that she received the first envelope from the Hartwick estate. Inside was a letter from a lawyer representing Catherine and Alina Hartwick's surviving relatives. The journals, once fully photographed and documented, had been made available for limited public access. The estate wanted Margaret to have copies. They wanted her to understand, they wrote, that none of this was her fault, and that the truth, which the journals had finally revealed, was perhaps the most important part of all of this. Margaret almost threw the envelope away. But she didn't. That evening, after work, she sat at her kitchen table and opened the copies of the journals that had arrived in the mail. And she began to read the truth about what had happened on June 15, 1956, and why 3 young people had allowed themselves to be buried alive beneath a Maple Grove house that would one day belong to a woman named Margaret Chen, who just wanted to feel less small than she'd been made to feel. Alina Hartwick's handwriting was careful and precise, the penmanship of someone educated, someone deliberate. Margaret read the first entry dated June 8, 1956, 3 days before the family would vanish. I have made a decision. This is the hardest thing I will ever write and the truest. James knows, Catherine knows. We have 3 days to prepare and then we will be free. Margaret turned the page, her heart already beating faster. The entries grew more intense as the dates approached June 15. Mother will never understand. That is perhaps the cruelest part of this, that I must let her believe we are dead rather than simply gone. But she is trapped in a world I can no longer bear to inhabit. She loves the company. She loves the money. She loves the appearance of normalcy more than she could ever love me. This is not a judgment, it is a fact, and I will not spend the remainder of my life performing normalcy. James's parents will be similarly devastated. That weight sits heavy in my chest. But James says that what we are about to do, the only way we can do it, requires a symbolic death. We must die to this life completely, or we will always be drawn back. Mother will grieve, yes. But eventually she will find peace in thinking us dead, in having a tragedy to explain our absence to society. The alternative, knowing we have simply chosen to leave her behind, would be far more destructive to her understanding of the world. Margaret read on, piecing together the story that the journals revealed. Alina Hartwick had met James Hartwick at Vassar College. He was a visiting lecturer, 12 years older than her, progressive in a way that threatened the very foundations of her family's conservative worldview. Her mother, Constance Hartwick, had been horrified. The relationship was forbidden. But Alina was brilliant and stubborn, and she had fallen in love not just with James, but with the idea that a woman could choose her own path, even if that path led directly against everything her family demanded. When Alina became pregnant in 1955, Constance's response was swift and absolute. Alina was to be hidden away, the pregnancy terminated or given away in shame, and then she would be married off to a suitable man of the family's choosing. Under no circumstances would she be allowed to keep a child conceived out of wedlock, and under absolutely no circumstances would she be allowed to remain in contact with James Hartwick. Alina had refused. The argument had been catastrophic. Alina had left the house and gone to live with James, who had secured lodgings in the city and was secretly raising funds for their escape. Catherine, Alina's younger sister by 3 years and just as intelligent and rebellious in her own way, had discovered the secret and instead of reporting it, had chosen to join them. The plan was elegant in its desperation. They had friends, bohemian types that the Hartwick family would never have approved of, who had connections to what Alina called the Underground Railroad for disappeared women. There were people, apparently, who would help women escape lives they could no longer bear. People who would provide new identities, new names, new lives in places where a woman's past had no power over her future. But such an operation required secrecy and symbolism. The women who disappeared this way had to truly disappear. They had to die, in a sense, so that their families would eventually accept their absence rather than spend years searching, dragging the name of the Hartwick Industries through scandal and speculation. Alina and James and Catherine had planned it meticulously. The baby, Alina's daughter, would be born in secret, and all 3 of them would vanish in a way that would appear final and tragic. An accident, they'd thought, or maybe something that would be so clearly a murder-suicide that police would eventually stop investigating. What Alina hadn't anticipated, what became clear only as Margaret read deeper into the journals, was that Victor Hartwick, Alina's father and Catherine's father, had discovered the plan. And he had intervened. June 13, 1956. Father came to James's apartment today. I do not know how he found it. I do not know if Mother told him or if his investigators tracked us. But he came and he was not angry. That was the worst part. He was not angry. He was resigned, almost sad. He told me that he knew about the plan, about Alina and her friends. He said that he could not permit it, not because he cared about my happiness or my freedom. He has made that abundantly clear through his disinterest in my actual thoughts and desires, but because the scandal would be unacceptable. A Hartwick daughter disappeared, a Hartwick son-in-law implicated in her vanishing. The company would suffer. The family name would be dragged through every society column and police report in the country. Then let us go, I told him. If the only problem is that we will embarrass you, then let us simply go, and you will have the tragedy to lean on rather than the scandal. He smiled, he actually smiled, and he said something I will never forget. My dear girl, I have built my life on controlling outcomes. I will not allow my own blood to humiliate me, whether through scandal or tragedy. There is a third option, and it is the one we will be taking. He did not tell me what that option was. Not then. But I could see it in his eyes, some calculation I was not meant to understand. Some solution that did not involve my happiness, my freedom, or my survival as a person I recognized as myself. The next entry was dated June 15, 1956. Alina's handwriting had changed slightly, less controlled, the letters larger and more desperate. Father has asked us to meet him at the old house, the one being demolished. He said he has a proposition, something that would satisfy everyone. A way for us to disappear that would be more convincing than anything we had planned. I did not want to go, but James said we should listen. Perhaps Father had come around. Perhaps he would help us instead of hinder us. Perhaps blood was thicker than propriety after all. We were so stupid. We were so very stupid. The old house is being demolished next week. It has been empty for months, abandoned after the renovations failed. The new owner, whoever that was, had given permission for the wrecking crew to clear it entirely and demolish the current structure down to the cellar. Father mentioned casually that the cellar was going to be sealed, that everything within it would be buried, that no one would ever look there again. You want to disappear, he said to us, and I remember the exact tone, not angry but thoughtful, like he was solving a puzzle. You want your past lives to end, I will grant you that wish. You will end. You will disappear. And when you do, the scandal will be complete, but at least there will be an ending. The story will be tragic, but it will be finished. Then he showed us what was in the cellar of the old house. He showed us the car. A 1956 Chevrolet already placed there, already positioned, and beside it bottles of chloroform and a ledger with names and dates. I finally understood what he had done, what he had always been doing. The ledger contained the names of at least 20 women who had disappeared over the past 5 years. Women from prominent families, women who had become inconvenient, women whose exits had been orchestrated not as compassionate disappearances but as permanent silences. You have a choice, Father said to James, and his voice was ice. Your daughter will be born into a new life and you three will have your disappearance, or I will make sure that the disappearance is exactly what it appears to be, a tragedy, a family death, no escape, just a grave. Catherine began to cry. I put my arm around her. And James, I watched his face as he understood that he had never really had any power at all, that everything he had fought for could be erased in a moment by a man with money and connections, and the absolute certainty that his will was the only will that mattered. We will take the disappearance, James said. His voice was steadier than I expected. We will take it and we will be grateful. And so that is what we did. We climbed into the car with our daughter, born only weeks before, small and perfect and innocent of the hell that her grandfather was gifting her as a legacy. We sealed ourselves in. Father sealed the cellar, and the world was told that we had died in a murder-suicide, a tragedy of love and madness. The reality is more complex. We are not dead, but we are not alive in any way that this world would recognize. Whoever reads this, if anyone ever reads this, know that we chose this. Not willingly, not happily, but we chose survival over the alternative, and we have made our peace with that choice. By the time you are reading this, we will have been dead for so many years that a grave will seem like a mercy. The entry ended there. Margaret sat back from the journal, her hands shaking. She understood now. She understood exactly what a leaner meant. They hadn't been buried, they'd been hidden. The car had been sealed in the cellar not as a tomb, but as a chrysalis. Eleanor, James, and Catherine, along with Eleanor's newborn daughter, had allowed themselves to be entombed so completely that they could be presumed dead by everyone who knew them. It was an elaborate ritual of destruction and rebirth. They had new names. They had new lives. Somewhere in the country, they were living under assumed identities, free from Victor Hartwick's control and their family's expectations. They had paid the price of being dead to everyone they loved, of existing as ghosts in a world that would always believe they were grave goods. Margaret picked up the second journal, Catherine's, and found it filled with similar themes, though Catherine's writing was more poetic, more angry, more raw than Eleanor's careful documentation. We are dying by choice. We are killing ourselves not with our bodies but with our names. We are slipping out of the world like water through fingers, and it is the only way we know how to be free. Father will be remembered as a man of tragedy. Mother will be pitied. The company will rally around the family's sorrow, and we will be free. I wonder sometimes if freedom has always required this kind of death. If every woman who has ever wanted something different from what the world demanded has had to let herself be buried first. Margaret read well into the night. By the time she finished both journals, she understood the full depth of the tragedy and the strange mercy at its heart. Eleanor and James and Catherine had willingly disappeared. They had used Victor Hartwick's own willingness to hide them, to preserve them, as a means of escaping his control. They had given up everything, their names, their families, their entire lives in society, but they had gained freedom. And somewhere, somehow, they had begun again. The mystery of the journals was that they had been deliberately left behind. They had been wrapped in waterproof cloth, sealed in a chest, and hidden in the cellar with the car. Eleanor and Catherine's final gift to the world was the truth. They didn't want to be mysteries forever. They wanted eventually to be known. And now, because Margaret had wanted a swimming pool, they were known. The next morning, Margaret called Detective Morris and told him she wanted to read the journals in full. She told him she wanted to understand the complete picture before speaking publicly about what had happened on her property. "That's very thoughtful," Morris said, sounding genuinely pleased. "Most people just want to distance themselves from the whole thing." "Well," Margaret said quietly, "I seem to be intimately connected to it now, whether I want to be or not." By the following week, the story had shifted completely. A major news outlet had obtained copies of the journals and published selected excerpts. The narrative had changed from mysterious cold case solved to father's horrific control drives 3 young people to choose symbolic suicide for freedom. Victor Hartwick's name was dragged through the press posthumously. He died in 1978, so there was no one left to defend him directly, though Hartwick Industries' current board issued a statement distancing themselves from the historical behavior of a man who was no longer living to provide context for his actions. Eleanor and James and Catherine, or rather the people they had become, eventually reached out through lawyers. They did not want to be identified. Their privacy, they stressed, was more important than closure. They had been given their names back, in a sense, by the revelation of the journals. That was enough. But they did something unexpected. They established a scholarship fund in the name of the 3 Hartwick victims, designating money specifically for women seeking to escape restrictive family situations and start new lives. In Eleanor's memory, they wrote, "For all the women who had to disappear to be free." Margaret was invited to the fund's first gala, held 3 months after the discovery. She almost declined, but something made her go. Some part of her needed to feel just once that her accidental unearthing of this tragedy had led to something redemptive. It was there at the gala that she finally saw Corinne Henderson's face when she realized the truth. Corinne was there too, of course. She always had to be wherever attention was gathered. She'd wormed her way onto the gala's planning committee and was walking around taking credit for bringing the Hartwick story to light, as if her gossip had been some kind of public service. But when she overheard Margaret speaking with one of the foundation directors, speaking about the journals, about Eleanor's desire for freedom, about the price of disappearing to become yourself, Margaret saw the exact moment that Corinne understood something crucial. That Margaret had accidentally been part of something bigger than both of them. That Margaret's search for petty victory over Karen had led to the resurrection of history. That Margaret had won in a way Karen could never have predicted and could never replicate. And more importantly, that Margaret had emerged from the scandal not as a villain, but as the person who had brought truth into light. Karen's smile froze. She excused herself and left the gala within 10 minutes. Margaret watched her go, feeling nothing but a strange, hollow sadness. The victory she'd wanted so badly, to make Karen feel small, had come, but it had arrived so twisted and complicated and tied to tragedy that it offered no satisfaction at all. By the time winter arrived, Margaret's backyard had been officially released by the police and the Historical Preservation Society. The cellar had been sealed with a small memorial plaque, site of the Hartwick family disappearance, June 15, 1956, and left otherwise undisturbed. Margaret had decided not to rebuild the pool. Instead, she spent the autumn months transforming her backyard into something else entirely. She hired a landscape architect, a young woman named Sophia who specialized in memorial gardens, and together they designed a space that honored both the tragedy that had occurred there and the freedom that Eleanor, James, and Catherine had purchased with their symbolic death. There was a small fountain, fed by underground springs. There were flowering trees, magnolias that would bloom in late spring, cherry trees that would snow white petals onto the earth each April. There were stone benches positioned around the perimeter, perfect for sitting and thinking, for remembering, for whatever visitors needed them for. In the center, Sophia had suggested a small reflecting pool, not a swimming pool, but something quieter, something that existed primarily to mirror the sky. Margaret had initially resisted the irony, but then she'd accepted it. Life was full of ironies, why not embrace them? The garden's opening coincided with the publication of a book. A historian named Dr. James Whitmore had become fascinated by the Hartwick case and had spent months researching Victor Hartwick's other disappearances. What he found was chilling and extensive. A man who had systematized the removal of inconvenient women and their children through fake accidents, presumed deaths, and outright murders. Of the 20 women listed in the ledger that had been discovered with Eleanor and Catherine's journals, only 7 had been confirmed as having actually survived and escaped through Eleanor's Underground Railroad method. The other 13 had been found in various locations around the city: car accidents, suicides, apparent murders. Some had never been found at all. The book, Buried, became a bestseller. It was a meticulous, devastating portrait of a man who had used his wealth and connections to erase women from the world, whether they wanted to disappear or not. And it made Margaret's garden into something more than she'd intended, a pilgrimage site for people interested in historical justice. By spring, people were coming from around the state to see the memorial. Some brought flowers. Some brought photographs of missing relatives. Some came simply to sit on the stone benches and contemplate what it meant to be erased and how much courage it must have taken to choose that erasure voluntarily. Margaret found herself becoming, almost accidentally, a kind of historical custodian. Journalists would contact her asking for stories. Historians would reach out requesting interviews. A documentary crew wanted to film the garden and get Margaret's perspective on the discovery. She accepted these requests reluctantly. She hadn't wanted to be the face of this tragedy, but she was beginning to understand that she had been given a kind of responsibility through accident. She was the living link between the hidden past and the revealed present. People wanted to hear her story, not just Eleanor's. So she told it. In interviews, Margaret spoke about wanting a pool, about trying to outdo a neighbor, about the petty motivations that had led her to commission the excavation that had literally unearthed history. She didn't apologize for those motivations. There was something honest in admitting that she'd been driven by vanity and competitiveness, and people seemed to respond to that honesty. They could see themselves in her. They could understand that great things often came from small, flawed desires. "If I had been a better person," Margaret said in one particularly widely quoted interview, "if I had simply accepted my neighbor's superiority and lived with it, Eleanor and James and Catherine would still be dead in my backyard, and the truth about their father would have gone with them." Sometimes the universe doesn't reward virtue. Sometimes it just requires that we be flawed at exactly the right moment in history. It was during this period of modest fame that Karen Henderson finally broke. Margaret didn't see it happen. Nobody did, not in the moment. What happened was this: Karen, unable to bear being sidelined in a story in which her own neighborhood had become significant, had attempted to insert herself into the narrative by claiming that she'd always suspected something was wrong with Margaret's property. She'd given an interview to a local podcast series about true crime, and in that interview she'd suggested, not directly but with implication, that Margaret might have had more advanced knowledge of the cellar than she'd admitted. "That kind of pool project is so ambitious," Corinne had said, with that practiced concern in her voice. "I always wondered if maybe Margaret knew something about the property that other people didn't, whether she was really trying to hide evidence." The accusation was absurd. It had been investigated and definitively debunked by police. But Corinne had planted the seed anyway, thinking maybe it would generate enough doubt to shift attention back to her as the savvy neighbor who'd seen through the deception. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The podcast's audience, which included a substantial number of people who'd become invested in the Hartwick story, had turned on Corinne with the kind of viciousness that only comes from righteous indignation. The podcast received thousands of angry messages. A subreddit dedicated to the case organized a systematic review of every public statement Corinne had made, fact-checking them and finding, consistently, that she'd been embellishing her role, exaggerating her proximity to events, and generally trying to insert herself into someone else's story for attention. Someone Margaret never found out who had compiled everything Corinne had said in every interview and every social media post, and created a video titled, "Corinne Henderson Has No Idea What She's Talking About," a supercut, and posted it online. The video had gone viral before Corinne even knew it existed. By the time Corinne realized what was happening, the narrative had shifted entirely. She was no longer the concerned neighbor. She was the bitter HOA president who tried to monetize tragedy for social media clout. She was the person who couldn't let someone else have their moment without trying to claim part of it as her own. Margaret watched it happen from a distance. She didn't take pleasure in it exactly, though she couldn't entirely claim she took no pleasure in it either. It was more complicated than pleasure. It was a kind of justice, though not the kind she'd originally sought. The HOA held an emergency meeting to address the Corinne Henderson situation. There was a motion to remove her from the presidency. Corinne fought it viciously, but she'd exhausted too much goodwill and generated too much resentment. The vote was nearly unanimous. 2 weeks later, a larger development occurred. Corinne's husband, Tom, filed for divorce. In the divorce filing, he cited irreconcilable differences and publicly damaging behavior. The news spread through the neighborhood like fire. Apparently, Tom had been increasingly uncomfortable with Corinne's attention-seeking, but her attempt to profit from the Hartwick tragedy had been the final straw. In a particularly vicious turn of events, someone had leaked the divorce filing to the same podcast that had covered Corinne's false claims, and suddenly the whole neighborhood learned that Tom Henderson was very publicly distancing himself from his wife. By summer, the Hendersons' perfect marriage had become a neighborhood legend about marital dissolution. The divorce was finalized in August, and the house was put up for sale by September. Margaret heard about it through the neighborhood email chain. She felt an odd mixture of emotions: vindication, sympathy, a strange residue of the old desire to feel superior. Corinne was being destroyed in her way, not by Margaret directly, but by the exact same consequences of her own choices that she had always inflicted on others. The universe, it seemed, had finally decided to practice some karmic poetic justice. But as Margaret sat in her living room, reading the details of Corinne's humiliation, she realized something that troubled her. She didn't feel as satisfied as she'd thought she would. She called David Chen, her attorney, who had remained friendly even after the legal situation had fully resolved. "Is this justice?" she asked him without preamble when he picked up. "Hello to you too," he said, laughing. "Justice for what, the Hartwick case?" "No, for Corinne, for my neighbor, for everything that happened between us." There was a pause. David was a smart man. He understood what Margaret was really asking. "I don't think justice works the way you think it does," he finally said. "I think we imagine that justice will feel like vindication, that it will taste sweet, but usually it just tastes like salt. It tastes like the price that both sides had to pay for things to be made right. If Corinne's being destroyed, then you're watching someone's life dissolve in front of you. That's not victory, Margaret, that's just tragedy happening to someone else." After they hung up, Margaret sat for a long time in her kitchen, looking out at the memorial garden she'd built. The reflecting pool caught the light of the setting sun, mirroring it perfectly, showing the sky as it truly was, not idealized, not beautified, just accurately reflected. She thought about Alina choosing to disappear, about James making peace with the choice, about Catherine accepting symbolic death to purchase freedom. All three of them had paid an enormous price, and in the end they had been free, but they had also been dead in all the ways that mattered to the world. And Corinne, in her own petty way, had done something similar. She destroyed her marriage, her reputation, her standing in the community by insisting on being the center of a story that had nothing to do with her. She'd made choices that had consequences. That was justice, Margaret supposed, but it wasn't the kind of justice that made anyone happy. Margaret picked up her phone and, for the first time in months, texted Corinne's old number. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because she needed to know that some part of this still mattered to someone. The text bounced back. Corinne had already deleted her number or changed her phone entirely. Margaret was not surprised. The documentary aired on a Tuesday evening in late September, exactly 1 year after Margaret had broken ground on her pool. She watched it alone in her living room, sitting on her couch with a glass of wine and the strange sensation of seeing her own life presented as narrative. The title was Beneath, and it told the full story: Alina's journals, Victor Hartwick's crimes, the 3 lives that had been sacrificed and resurrected simultaneously. But it also told Margaret's story, the woman who had wanted a pool and had instead become the accidental custodian of history. The documentary was kind to Margaret, kinder than she'd expected. It presented her as a woman who had been driven by understandable human desires, competitiveness, the need to feel significant, and who had then been forced, through circumstance, to reckon with something far larger than her own ego. In one particularly revealing segment, Margaret spoke about the moment she decided not to rebuild the pool. "I realized," she said to the camera, "that I didn't want to win anymore, that if I had won it would have just been a pool, just something that Alina Henderson could use if she wanted to or ignore if she didn't. But this," she gestured toward the garden outside her window, "this was something that meant something. This was something that told a story that needed to be told." And that felt more important than being right. After the documentary aired, Margaret's life changed in subtle but significant ways. The phone calls increased. Universities wanted her to give lectures about the intersections of historical trauma and personal discovery. Women's organizations wanted her on their boards. A publisher reached out asking if she'd be interested in writing a memoir. She turned down most of it, but she did agree to give a lecture series at the local university about the ethics of historical discovery. What responsibility did ordinary people have when they stumbled upon truth? What did it mean to be the custodian of tragedy? It was in the middle of her 3rd lecture that something remarkable happened. A woman in the audience, older, probably in her 70s, with kind eyes and silver hair, raised her hand during the Q&A session. "I want to thank you," she said quietly, "for what you've done, for keeping Alina's story alive. I'm not sure if it matters, but I want you to know that it does." Margaret felt something catch in her throat. "Do I know you?" she asked. The woman smiled sadly. "Not exactly, but I think my mother knew Alina. I think I might have met Alina when I was very young, before." She didn't elaborate on what before meant, but Margaret understood. She understood that she might be standing in front of someone who had been touched by Alina's disappearance, someone who carried that story in their family history as an absence, a mystery, a grief that had never fully resolved. After the lecture, the woman came to Margaret's office. Her name was Diana, and she was a retired social worker. She brought with her a photograph. It was taken in the 1970s, faded and worn, but still recognizable. It showed a woman who looked remarkably like Alina, according to the journal's descriptions, standing in front of a house somewhere that looked like New England. She was holding a toddler. She was smiling. "My mother found this in an old box about 5 years ago," Diana said. "She didn't know what to do with it. She wasn't sure if it was Alina or not. She'd been just a child when Alina disappeared, and she had this vague memory of a woman who came to stay with them for a while, a woman who was very sad but very kind, a woman who was moving to start a new life." But she never knew for certain. When Alina's story came out, when the journals were published, my mother recognized the handwriting in one of the journal pages that was shown on television. It was Alina's. The woman in the photograph had been Alina, or rather, Alina become whoever she was meant to be. Margaret stared at the photograph, a woman who had chosen to die so she could live, a woman who had built a new life, a real life, somewhere away from her family's control. Your mother, Margaret asked carefully, did she ever talk to Alina after she recognized her? Diana shook her head. She wanted to, but by then Alina had passed away. She died in 1998. My mother only found the photograph after she herself was diagnosed with cancer, cleaning out old things. By the time she understood who Alina was, Alina had been dead for years. I'm so sorry, Margaret said and meant it. Don't be, Diana smiled again. My mother said that knowing the truth, knowing that Alina had lived, had made it to safety, had become whoever she wanted to be, was more important than anything else. It answered the question that had lived in her family's memory for decades. Did Alina get away? Did she make it? And the answer was yes, she did. Diana left the photograph with Margaret, along with her contact information. She wanted Margaret to know that Alina's story didn't end with the journals. It continued through the lives Alina had touched, through the woman she'd become, through a photograph that had survived decades in a box, and finally found its way to the person who could understand what it meant. Over the next year, Margaret received similar letters and visits. A woman who said her grandmother had possibly worked with Alina at a hospital in Maine. A man who swore he'd seen James at a college in Vermont. A historian who'd found documentary evidence of a woman matching Alina's description living in a small town in upstate New York. None of these people could be certain. Alina had done her job well, she'd disappeared completely. But the fact that people cared enough to search, to remember, to keep Alina's story alive in small ways, seemed important to Margaret. She began organizing these stories. She created a document, started as something private, but that eventually became public, of every second-hand sighting, every rumor, every possible trace of Alina's life after June 15, 1956. It was a narrative of absence and presence combined, a story told not through direct evidence, but through the impression of a life lived, like footprints in snow. By the time Margaret turned 60, she had become something she'd never anticipated, a keeper of mystery. Not someone who'd solved the mystery of the Hartwick disappearance, but someone who'd helped preserve the many small mysteries that surrounded how Alina had lived after she'd learned to disappear. The garden continued to grow. Flowers bloomed and died and returned with the seasons. The stone benches were worn smooth by people sitting on them, thinking their own private thoughts about freedom and sacrifice and the price of becoming yourself. One afternoon in the spring, Margaret was sitting by the reflecting pool when Corinne Henderson appeared at her gate. Margaret hadn't seen her in over a year. Corinne had moved to another state, Virginia, she'd heard through the grapevine. The rumor was that she'd been trying to start over, rebuild her reputation in a place where nobody knew her history. But here she was, standing at the gate of the garden, looking smaller somehow, quieter. The aggressive certainty that had always characterized her seemed to have been worn away. "Can I come in?" Corinne asked. Margaret almost said no, but something in her, the same thing that had kept her from completely destroying Corinne when she'd had the chance, made her nod instead. Corinne walked through the garden slowly, looking at the flowers, the benches, the memorial plaque. She stood for a long time at the reflecting pool, looking at her own reflection as if seeing herself for the first time. "I'm sorry," she said finally, without looking at Margaret. "I know that probably doesn't mean much. I know I've said or implied a lot of things that made your life worse. I know I took something that was already difficult and tried to make it about me." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She was trying to decide what she felt about Corinne's apology. Gratitude, forgiveness, skepticism, all of these things in layers. "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret finally asked. "Because my therapist said I should," Corinne laughed bitterly. "Which probably makes the apology worth less, doesn't it? But it's true. I've been seeing someone in Virginia. She helped me understand that I've spent my entire life trying to be in control of my image, of how people saw me, of what story was being told about me. And that when I couldn't control it, when you became the interesting one, when the story became about you, I just doubled down on trying to rewrite it. Instead of accepting that I'm not the center of every story." She finally looked at Margaret. "Your neighbor, the old version of your neighbor, made you feel small. And I wasn't doing that to help you. I was doing it because I needed to feel big, and I'm sorry for that. You didn't deserve it." Margaret considered this. She considered the woman who was standing in front of her, not the caricature, but the actual person. Someone who had been unhappy enough to seek help, brave enough to try to change, willing enough to apologize to someone she'd made miserable. "Come sit," Margaret said, gesturing to one of the stone benches. They sat in silence for a long time, looking at the garden. The reflecting pool caught the afternoon light and threw it back at them, showing them both exactly what was there. Not idealized, not rewritten, just accurate. "I built this garden," Margaret said finally, "because I wanted to create something that meant something. Something that honored people I'd never met but whose lives had touched mine through the accident of archaeology. I wanted it to be about truth, if I could manage that." "It is," Karen said quietly. "I can feel it. This place feels honest." They sat a while longer. Margaret found that she didn't hate Karen anymore. That surprise of discovery faded away, replaced by something more like compassion, not quite forgiveness, but a willingness to see Karen as something other than a villain in her own life's narrative. "Are you staying?" Margaret asked as the sun began to lower in the sky. "No, I have to get back to Virginia. I wanted to. I don't know. I wanted to see the garden, and I wanted to apologize. I wanted to know if you could forgive me." "I don't know if I can," Margaret said honestly. "But I can forgive the version of us that came before this. I can let that version go." Karen nodded. She stood to leave, but paused at the gate. "Eleanor, from the journals, she said something that stuck with me. She said that every woman has to decide what version of herself she's willing to sacrifice to become free. I think I finally understand what she meant." After Karen left, Margaret sat alone in the garden as evening settled into dusk. The garden was beautiful, she thought, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. It was a monument to the people who had disappeared, both physically and in spirit. It was a place where stories came to rest and be remembered. Margaret thought about Eleanor choosing symbolic death to purchase freedom. She thought about Karen choosing to die to an old version of herself, not as an escape, but as an acceptance of who she was and who she wanted to become. And she thought about herself, Margaret, who had wanted only a pool, who had accidentally become an archaeologist of the past, who had learned that revenge was less satisfying than redemption, that victory was less important than meaning. The reflecting pool showed her back to herself as the sun dipped below the horizon. A woman in her 60s, sitting alone in a garden filled with flowers and ghosts, finally at peace with the accident of her own importance. 5 years after the discovery of the cellar, Maple Grove Drive looked much the same as it always had. The houses were still charming, the lawns still manicured, the streets still radiating that particular kind of suburban perfection that came from collective effort and shared values. But something had changed in the collective memory of the neighborhood. The scandal of the Hartwick discovery had imprinted itself on the street's identity. It was no longer just Maple Grove Drive. It was the street where Eleanor Hartwick's car had been buried, where truth had erupted from beneath someone's swimming pool, where history had literally surfaced in the middle of ordinary life. Margaret had made peace with this. The memorial garden had become something she managed rather than something she maintained, if the distinction could be made. Over the years, other people had become interested in helping. Locals who'd become invested in Eleanor's story, historians who wanted to ensure the site was preserved accurately, volunteers who trimmed the hedges and planted seasonal flowers. A nonprofit had been established to oversee the garden. Margaret remained on the board, but the responsibility had been distributed. What had started as her personal project had become something communal, something shared. On a Saturday in early June, exactly 5 years after the car had been discovered, the garden held its first annual memorial celebration. It wasn't a funeral. It wasn't a celebration in the traditional sense. It was more like a gathering of people who had been touched, directly or indirectly, by Eleanor's story and who wanted to remember her not as a cold case, not as a historical mystery, but as a woman who had lived and suffered and fought for her own freedom. Diana came, bringing her elderly mother, Margaret's first, most important link to Eleanor as a living person rather than a historical figure. The social worker and her mother had become close friends with Margaret over the years, and they'd become the unofficial keepers of the Eleanor narrative in the family, making sure their younger relatives understood the story and what it meant. The documentary filmmaker came, along with a producer who wanted to develop a follow-up project about what had happened to the memorial in the years since the discovery. Several historians arrived, including Dr. Whitmore, who'd written the definitive book about Victor Hartwick and his victims. He'd become something of an expert on the case and was considered the authority on the subject. Survivors of Victor Hartwick's other crimes had been contacted. Some had chosen to attend. It was a difficult gathering. These were people whose family members had actually been murdered, whose cases would never be solved the way Aliner's had been. But they came, and they shared their stories, and they seemed grateful that at least one family's tragedy had been brought to light and acknowledged. Margaret had prepared remarks. She'd written them down and practiced them several times, but when the moment came to stand and speak, she found she wanted to discard the notes and speak from something more honest. Aliner Hartwick disappeared on June 15, 1956, Margaret said, looking out at the gathered crowd, perhaps 50 people, all connected to this history in different ways. For 68 years, she was believed to be dead. She was mourned as dead. Her mother died never knowing what happened to her daughter and died believing to the end that her daughter was gone. But Aliner wasn't dead. She was somewhere building a life, making choices, becoming the person she wanted to be. She paid an enormous price for that freedom. She gave up her name, her family, her entire life as she'd known it. But she bought something that a lot of people never get to buy, the chance to write her own story. When my pool broke open and revealed the car and the cellar where Aliner had chosen to wait, it felt like a violation. It felt like the discovery was pulling Aliner's privacy violation. But what I've learned over the years is that Aliner left the journals there deliberately. She wanted to be known. She wanted her story told. She was comfortable with that violation because she had chosen it. So I think what we're here to do today is not to mourn Aliner as someone who was lost, but to celebrate her as someone who was brave enough to disappear so she could be free. And I think we're here to honor the fact that even when the past is forgotten, even when history is buried, the truth has a way of surfacing eventually. And sometimes, Margaret concluded, looking out over the garden, the flowers Aliner would never see, the benches where strangers sat thinking about the nature of freedom and sacrifice, the reflecting pool that showed back only what was true. Sometimes that surfacing of truth is the only justice the dead ever get. So we remember, we garden. We keep Aliner's story alive for anyone who needs to know that disappearance can be choice, that sacrifice can be liberation, and that freedom sometimes comes at the cost of everything we thought defined us. She sat down. Diana was crying silently. Dr. Whitmore was writing notes. The other attendees sat in the kind of respectful silence that comes from having been reminded of something important. Later that evening, after most of the attendees had left, Margaret was alone in the garden as the sun set. She was sweeping flower petals that had fallen during the day, a meditative task that she'd come to enjoy. Derek appeared at the gate. Derek, her original contractor, the man who'd started all of this by discovering the concrete cap that hid Aliner's cellar. He'd retired from his contracting business about 3 years ago, but he still checked in on the garden occasionally, still felt some connection to the site that had changed both their lives. "Beautiful service," he said, helping Margaret with the sweeping. "Thank you for coming," Margaret replied. They worked in comfortable silence for a while. Then Derek said, "You know, I've thought about that day a lot. The day the pool collapsed. I've thought about what would have happened if we hadn't hit that concrete. If I'd just worked around it like you asked. Aliner would still be in the ground. Nobody would know her story." "Yes," Margaret said. "Do you think," Derek continued carefully, "that the universe wanted this to happen? Do you think Aliner knew somehow that someone would eventually dig her up and tell her story?" Margaret smiled sadly. "I think Aliner left the journals there hoping someone would dig them up eventually. I think she wanted to be known. As for whether the universe conspired to make that happen, I don't know. I think we tell stories to make sense of coincidence. We see pattern where there might be none, but Aliner's story felt so important that maybe it was inevitable that it would eventually surface. Maybe truth has its own gravity." They finished sweeping. Derek left, and Margaret stood alone as twilight deepened into full darkness. The garden was beautiful at night, the stone benches catching what light there was, the reflecting pool now a mirror to the stars rather than the sky. Margaret thought about Aliner one more time, about the choice Aliner had made to seal herself away in that car, to disappear so completely that death seemed more real than her survival. About the decades Aliner must have lived knowing that everyone who had ever loved her believed her to be dead. About the price of that freedom, paid moment by moment, year after year, in the knowledge that she could never go back, never explain, never receive the forgiveness and understanding that might have healed her original wounds. And yet she had chosen it, deliberately, willingly, because the alternative, living under Victor Hartwick's control, performing normalcy, sacrificing her autonomy to maintain her family's reputation, had been more suffocating than death. That choice, Margaret thought, deserved to be remembered. not as a tragedy, but as an act of courage, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a testament to what a person could endure when freedom was the only thing left worth fighting for. The memorial garden would stand. The story would be told and retold. Eleanor Hartwick would be remembered not as a disappearance, but as a woman who had made an impossible choice and lived long enough to see that choice honored and understood. And Margaret, who had wanted only a swimming pool, would continue to be the accidental custodian of that memory, the woman who'd broken ground in the right place at the right time, who'd allowed history to surface, who'd chosen meaning over victory. Years later, when Margaret was old and ready to pass the burden of the garden to younger hands, Diana would take it over completely. The nonprofit would expand. A museum would eventually open on the grounds, not a museum of death, but a museum of liberation, dedicated to telling the stories of women who disappeared from society only to be found, or to have their stories found by future generations. Eleanor's journals would be housed there, behind protective glass, available for anyone who wanted to understand what it felt like to choose to disappear, to voluntarily die so that a better self could be born. And sometimes, visitors would stand in the garden where Eleanor's car had been buried and would think about their own lives, their own constraints, their own versions of captivity. And they would consider what price freedom might cost and whether that price might be worth paying. That was perhaps the greatest gift that Eleanor Hartwick's disappearance could give. Not answers to historical mysteries, but questions about how to live authentically in a world that constantly demanded we be someone other than ourselves. Margaret Chen, the woman with the broken pool, had given that gift to the world. And in doing so, she had learned the difference between winning and meaning, between being seen and being understood, between the satisfaction of revenge and the deeper satisfaction of redemption. On a quiet Tuesday evening, sitting in the garden as the light faded, Margaret finally understood what Eleanor had been trying to say in the final lines of her journal, that we are all buried in one way or another beneath the expectations of others, and that sometimes the only way to be free is to let ourselves be found by history, to let our stories surface whether we intended them to or not, and to trust that the truth eventually will speak for itself. The garden was beautiful. Eleanor had been brave, and Margaret had learned at last what it meant to tend to a legacy that was never intended to be hers, but which she had been given through accident, consequence, and the sheer force of historical gravity pulling truth up from the dark.